It was a quiet afternoon at the cemetery, the kind of day where the world felt like it was holding its breath. The air was still, the trees barely swayed, and the only sounds were the occasional chirping of birds and the distant hum of life outside the gates. Margaret stood near her husband's grave, her fingers tracing the engraved letters on the headstone. James Whitmore, beloved husband, gone too soon. The words felt as heavy as they had the day they were carved into stone. A year had passed since James's death, but the grief still clung to Margaret like a shadow. Some days were easier, but others, days like this, felt impossible. She placed a small bouquet of lilies at the base of the headstone, whispering, "I miss you." She expected nothing in return, just the silence that had become familiar. But today, the silence was different. It was interrupted by something unexpected. A soft rustling sound. Footsteps on the grass. Margaret turned, her heart skipping a beat. Just a few feet away, standing near the other side of the grave, was a young black girl. Maybe 10, maybe 11 years old. She was small, with dark brown eyes that held something deeper than a child should carry. In her hands, she clutched a single white rose. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen this child before. And yet, the way the girl stood there, hesitant, quiet, looking at the grave, felt personal, almost intimate. As if she had been here before. Margaret forced a polite smile, though confusion swirled inside her. "Hello, sweetheart. Are you lost?" The girl didn't answer right away. She just stared at the grave, at the name, at the flowers already placed there. Then, slowly, she knelt and set her white rose next to Margaret's lilies. Margaret's stomach twisted. Something about the way the child did it, the careful placement, the quiet reverence, it didn't feel random. It felt deliberate, purposeful, like this wasn't the first time. Margaret swallowed. Did you know my husband?" The girl finally looked up, her dark eyes locking onto Margaret's. For a second, something flickered there, hesitation, maybe fear, but then she nodded. Margaret's heart pounded. How? James had never mentioned knowing a child. He had never spoken of any little girl, never given her reason to believe there was some secret part of his life she didn't know about. But standing here, looking at this child who had just left a flower at her husband's grave, she felt a cold unease creeping in. She took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl hesitated again, then whispered, "Ava." Margaret knelt slightly, keeping her voice gentle. "Ava, how did you know James?" Ava's fingers twisted the hem of her dress, her eyes dropping to the ground. She didn't speak right away, and Margaret could see the conflict on her face, as if she was trying to decide whether to answer at all. Finally, she whispered, "He was my friend." Margaret felt the words hit her like a gust of wind. Friend? How could James, a man who had been dedicated to his work, his home, and their marriage, have had a friend that Margaret had never heard of? And why was that friend a little girl? She opened her mouth, ready to ask more, but before she could, Ava suddenly stepped back. "I have to go." Margaret blinked. "Wait!" But the girl turned and hurried away, her small frame disappearing between the rows of headstones. Margaret stood frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had come here expecting another quiet afternoon of grief and remembrance. Instead, she was left with more questions than answers. Who was Ava? And what had James been hiding? Margaret stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where Ava had just been. The air around her felt heavier now, thick with questions she didn't know how to answer. A child, a little girl who knew James, who had called him her friend. How was that possible? And why had James never mentioned her? Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her purse, pulling out her phone. She hesitated before unlocking it, unsure of what she was even looking for. An old message from James? A picture? A clue? But as she scrolled through her photo gallery, past the countless pictures of her and James, their vacations, their quiet nights at home, she found nothing out of the ordinary. No little girl. No hint of another life. The thought sent a shiver through her. James had been a good man, kind, responsible, devoted. At least, that's what she had always believed. But now, standing here at his grave, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't know everything. She took a deep breath and turned back toward the headstone. The white rose Ava had left sat perfectly in place beside the lilies. Margaret crouched down and touched its petals, her fingers brushing against the soft edges. It was fresh. That meant Ava must have picked it up that day or the night before. But how many times had she done this before? Margaret glanced around, searching the cemetery for any sign of Ava, but the girl was gone. The only movement was the swaying of trees in the afternoon breeze. Maybe she should leave. Maybe she was overthinking all of this. It could be nothing, just a misunderstanding. But deep down, Margaret knew better. She had spent years with James, knew his routines, his habits, his past. And yet, somehow, a little girl had entered his life without her knowing. That didn't happen by accident. As she made her way to her car, her mind raced. She needed answers. That night, Margaret sat in the living room, an old photo album spread across the coffee table. She flipped through the pages slowly, tracing her fingers over pictures of her and James. Their wedding day, their first home, a trip to the lake. He had always been smiling in pictures, his eyes full of warmth. She had never questioned that smile before. But now, she wondered what else had been behind it. She reached for her phone and opened the contacts list, scrolling down until she found a familiar name. David Whitmore, James's brother. If anyone knew something, it would be him. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Margaret? Hey, it's been a while. She swallowed. Hi, David. Sorry to call so late. I need to ask you something. There was a pause on the other end. Sure. What's wrong? Margaret hesitated, then exhaled slowly. Did James ever mention a little girl named Ava? Silence. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. David? A deep breath came through the line. Why are you asking? Her pulse quickened. I saw her today, at the cemetery. She left a flower on his grave, David. She said James was her friend. More silence. It stretched long enough to make Margaret's chest tighten. Finally, David spoke, his voice quieter now. Margaret, maybe you should let this go. Her stomach twisted. What? Why? I don't think you'll like what you find. Margaret sat up straighter, her heart now pounding. So you do know something? Another pause. Then, finally a sigh. Look, I don't know much, okay? But a few months before James passed, he started acting different. Taking calls late at night. Leaving the house at odd hours. He told me it was work, but I wasn't sure. Then one day, he told me he needed to make something right. I never asked what he meant. Margaret's hands were cold. She gripped the phone tighter. Why didn't you tell me? David sighed again. Because I didn't think it mattered. James was a good man. And whatever this was, he took it with him. Margaret's throat felt tight. But now I have this little girl standing at his grave, and she knows him. And I don't. I need to understand, David. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, he said, if you really want answers, start with his office. Margaret's breath hitched. James's office. The room she had barely stepped into since he passed. It still held his things untouched, as if he would walk through the door at any moment. The thought of going through it now felt overwhelming. But what choice did she have? Okay, she said softly. Thank you. She ended the call, her heart heavy with unease. The next morning, Margaret stood at the doorway of James's office. The doorknob felt cool beneath her fingers as she pushed it open. The familiar scent of his cologne still lingered in the air. His desk sat exactly as he had left it. Papers stacked neatly, his chair pushed in, his laptop resting on the surface. Margaret swallowed hard as she stepped inside. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the desk drawer and pulled it open. Folders, documents, bills. Everything looked normal. But then, tucked beneath a stack of papers, she spotted something that made her breath catch. A small, worn notebook. Margaret pulled it out slowly, her fingers tracing the leather cover. She flipped it open, skimming through the pages. Most of it was filled with scribbled notes, reminders, dates. But then she saw it. Ava, 3 p.m., Park. Her chest tightened. Flipping through more pages, she found more entries. Ava's school. Ava's birthday. Keep this quiet. Margaret's hands shook. This wasn't just some casual friendship. James had been involved in this girl's life. He had been keeping track of her, meeting with her, making sure no one knew. Why? Her pulse pounded as she turned the pages faster. And then, on the last page, she found a note that made her blood run cold. If anything happens to me, make sure Ava is okay. Margaret felt the world tilt slightly. She stared at the words, her mind spinning. James had been protecting Ava. But from what? And why hadn't he told her? She closed the notebook, her breath shaky. She had started this search hoping for answers. But now, she had more questions than ever. Margaret sat frozen in James's office, her fingers still gripping the edges of the small, worn notebook. The weight of his words pressed down on her like a heavy fog. If anything happens to me, make sure Ava is okay. It wasn't just a note. It was a warning, a plea. And James had written it knowing something could happen to him. Her mind raced as she stared at the handwriting. So familiar, yet now carrying a meaning she didn't understand. Who was Ava to him? Why had he kept her a secret? And why was he afraid something would happen to him? A cold chill ran down Margaret's spine. The accident. That's what they had called it. A tragic car crash late at night. James losing control on a rainy road. But now, for the first time, Margaret questioned it. What if it wasn't just an accident? What if James had been running from something? Protecting Ava from something? She flipped back through the notebook, scanning the pages for more details. But there were only scattered notes, dates, reminders, brief mentions of meetings. There was nothing concrete. Nothing that told her who Ava really was or what James had been involved in. Margaret took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling. She needed more information, and there was only one person who might have answers. That afternoon, Margaret found herself outside Ava's school. It was a small elementary school, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where everything felt safe and ordinary. She stayed in her car, watching as children ran out of the front doors, their laughter filling the air. Parents stood nearby, waiting to pick up their kids. And then she saw her. Ava walked out slowly, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her head slightly down as if she was lost in thought. She looked so small, so fragile, yet there was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. Margaret hesitated. She had no idea what she was doing, no idea what she would even say. But before she could second-guess herself, she stepped out of the car and made her way toward Ava. The little girl noticed her immediately. She stopped in her tracks, her eyes widening slightly. Margaret crouched down to her level, keeping her voice gentle. Ava, hi, do you remember me? Ava's fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. She nodded slowly. Margaret forced a small smile. I was hoping we could talk, just for a minute. I found something of James's, and I think it's important. Ava didn't move. She just stared at Margaret, her dark eyes searching, as if trying to decide whether she could trust her. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, Did you find the notebook? Margaret's breath caught. She hadn't expected that. Ava knew about the notebook. Yes, she said carefully. I did. Ava glanced around, then took a small step closer. He told me if something happened, you might come looking for me. Margaret's heart pounded. Ava, I need to understand. Who is James to you? Ava swallowed. He was my dad's friend. He was helping us. Margaret felt the words sink into her skin. James had never mentioned helping anyone. He had never talked about any secret involvement in someone's life. But as she looked at Ava, she saw the truth in her eyes. Before Margaret could ask anything else, a voice called out. Ava! A woman stood a few feet away, her expression tense. She was in her early 40s, with warm brown skin and tired eyes that seemed to hold a world of worry. Ava immediately stepped back toward her, as if instinctively seeking protection. Margaret straightened, forcing a polite smile. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bother her. The woman's eyes flicked over Margaret carefully, then down to Ava. Are you okay, baby? Ava nodded. She knew James. The woman stiffened. For a brief second, something flickered across her face. Recognition, pain, something deeper than Margaret could place. Margaret hesitated. I'm James's wife. She stopped herself. Widow. It still felt strange to say. I found something, and I think James was trying to help you. I just don't know how. The woman's expression hardened. I don't know what you're talking about. Margaret's stomach twisted. Please. If you knew James, if he was involved in something important, I need to understand. I need to know what he was protecting. The woman's eyes flickered with something unreadable. She exhaled sharply, then said, "Not here." Margaret barely had time to process before the woman turned to Ava. "Let's go." Ava cast one last glance at Margaret before walking away with her. Margaret stood there, her pulse racing. She had come looking for answers, and instead, she had found more secrets. But one thing was clear now. James had been involved in something bigger than she had ever imagined. And whatever it was, it hadn't died with him. Margaret stood frozen, watching the woman and Ava disappear down the street. Her mind was racing, heart pounding, a whirlwind of questions crashing together. Who was this woman? Why had she reacted like that when she mentioned James? And why had Ava, this sweet, innocent child, seemed so familiar with James's secret life? She could feel the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down on her, suffocating her. She had to find out more, had to understand what was happening. But where could she go from here? Her first instinct was to follow them, to confront this woman, demand the truth. But something in her gut told her that charging in head first wouldn't work. No, this was bigger than she could handle alone. She needed help. That evening, as she sat at her kitchen table, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of a lamp, Margaret's thoughts kept spiraling back to the notebook. She had gone over it again and again, looking for any clue, anything that might give her an answer. But all she found was more confusion. The notes were cryptic, pieces of a puzzle she couldn't fit together. The words "make sure Ava is okay" still echoed in her mind. What had James known? Why had he been so concerned for this little girl? A knock on the door broke her from her thoughts. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Tentatively, she stood up and walked toward the door. When she opened it, she wasn't sure whether she was relieved or frightened to see David standing there. "Margaret," he said, his voice low, his eyes darting around nervously. "We need to talk." Her pulse quickened. "David, what's going on? What do you know about Ava? Why didn't you tell me anything before?" He stepped inside without waiting for her to invite him in. "I couldn't. I should have, but I couldn't." His voice was strained, as if he was holding back something urgent. "Look, Margaret, I don't know the whole story, but I know enough to tell you this. James didn't die in an accident." Her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" David ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting around the room, as if he was checking for anyone who might be listening. "It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. James had enemies, people who would have gone to great lengths to keep him quiet. And Ava, she's at the center of all of it." Margaret felt a cold shiver spread down her spine. "You're telling me James was murdered?" David looked at her, his face drawn, guilt heavy in his eyes. "I don't know for sure, but I'm telling you, whatever happened, it wasn't an accident." Margaret sat down at the kitchen table, her head spinning. "But why? Why would anyone hurt him?" David's voice dropped to a whisper. "James was involved in something much bigger than we ever realized. He was helping Ava's mother, helping her escape something dangerous." "Escape from what?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, the question trembling in the air between them. David looked over his shoulder again, then took a deep breath. "I don't know all the details, but I know that whatever James got tangled up in, it involved money, power, and people who would do anything to protect their secrets. Ava's mother, she was in hiding, and James was trying to help her stay safe." Margaret's chest tightened. "Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he share this with me? I could have helped." David shook his head, his expression pained. "James didn't want you involved. He was trying to protect you, Margaret. He didn't want you to be a target, too. I think he knew things were getting dangerous." Margaret stared at him, the pieces of the puzzle slowly beginning to fall into place. The secrecy, the late-night calls, the hidden meetings. It all made sense now, but it only raised more questions. Who was this woman, Ava's mother? And what had she been running from? "I need to know everything, David," Margaret said, her voice hardening. "Everything." David hesitated, glancing around the room as if deciding how much to tell her. Finally, he nodded. "I'll take you to someone who can explain more. But you need to be careful, Margaret. The people involved in this, they don't play by the rules." Margaret's heart raced. "Who are they?" David shook his head again. "I can't say. Not yet. Just trust me, okay? Trust me when I say it's bigger than you think. You need to be prepared." Margaret stood up, determination settling over her like a heavy coat. She didn't care how dangerous this was. She needed to know the truth. For James, for herself, and for Ava. "Let's go," she said firmly. David nodded, leading her toward the door. As they stepped out into the night, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. The air around them felt charged, heavy with the weight of secrets that had been buried for too long. And somewhere, in the shadows, the people who had been hiding these secrets were watching. As they drove through the darkened streets, Margaret's mind raced. She had thought that losing James had been the hardest thing she'd ever experienced. But now, with each passing minute, she realized that the true fight had just begun. Who was Ava's mother? What had she been running from? And most importantly, what did it have to do with James's death? The answers felt so close now, just out of reach but tantalizingly near. Margaret was ready to face whatever came next, ready to unearth the truth, no matter the cost. But as the car sped through the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was already making their move. And the danger wasn't just lurking in the shadows anymore. It was right in front of her. As the car made its way down the winding road, the tension in the air felt almost suffocating. Margaret could hear the steady rhythm of the engine, but her mind was too occupied to focus on anything else. The streets outside were a blur of streetlights and shadows, and the weight of what David had said hung heavily in the silence. She felt the unsettling sensation that something was off, that they were walking straight into the eye of a storm, but she couldn't quite place why. David had been so cryptic, and every answer he gave only seemed to lead to more questions. Who were these people, and what were they willing to do to protect their secrets? The possibilities haunted her as she turned over the information in her mind. Ava's mother, James's mysterious involvement, and now this cryptic promise from David. Someone else knew the truth. David's knuckles tightened on the steering wheel, and he glanced at her, his face pale in the dim light. "You're sure about this, Margaret?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with uncertainty. "Once you go down this road, there's no turning back." Margaret didn't answer right away. Her throat was dry, her heart racing in anticipation of whatever they were about to uncover. But deep down, she knew this was the only way to get the answer she needed. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady despite the unease that gnawed at her insides. The tension grew thicker as the minutes passed, and soon they were pulling up to a nondescript building tucked away behind a high, metal gate. It looked like any other warehouse, silent and imposing. A single light flickered above the door, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. David parked the car a few yards away, cutting the engine. The sudden stillness felt heavy. Margaret didn't move at first. She looked at David, searching his face for any sign of reassurance. But his expression was grim, his lips pressed into a thin line. Without a word, he opened the door and stepped out, leading Margaret toward the building. The air was colder now, and the night seemed unnaturally still. Margaret followed close behind, her breath shallow as her mind raced with everything she had learned so far. David knocked 3 times, and the door creaked open slowly. A tall figure appeared in the doorway, obscured by the shadow of the frame. The man's face was hidden in the darkness, but Margaret could make out the outline of his broad shoulders and the way he stood like someone accustomed to authority. "You brought her," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. David nodded. "This is Margaret. She's James's wife." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Margaret with a piercing gaze that made her feel like he was reading her every thought. Finally, he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. The inside of the building was nothing like she expected. It was a stark contrast to the quiet exterior, a maze of rooms, each one filled with documents, maps, and files scattered on every surface. There was an almost clinical coldness to the place, as if the whole operation was run by people who were always on the edge of a deadline. Margaret's pulse quickened as they walked deeper into the building, but she kept her focus on the man ahead of them. Who was he? What part did he play in all of this? "Have a seat," the man said, pointing to a chair at a small, metal table. Margaret sat down, her eyes never leaving him. David stayed standing, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. The man pulled up a chair across from Margaret, studying her for a long moment before speaking. "You're asking questions," he said bluntly. "I can see that, but you don't know the half of it. You don't know who you're dealing with." Margaret's heart raced. "I just want to know the truth," she said, her voice steady, though her insides were twisting in anticipation. "What happened to James? What was he involved in?" The man exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "James wasn't just trying to help Ava's mother," he said. "He was trying to protect her from a threat much larger than you can imagine." Margaret's mind spun. "A threat? What kind of threat?" The man looked over his shoulder, as if making sure no one was listening. "There's a group," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper. "A powerful group. People with connections, people who control things from the shadows. James got caught up with them. He found out things he shouldn't have known. And once you're in, there's no getting out." Margaret leaned forward, her breath catching. "What does that have to do with Ava's mother?" The man's face hardened. Ava's mother was part of their operation, but she tried to escape. She knew too much, so they tried to get rid of her. James was helping her stay hidden, helping her get away. But it was never enough. Margaret's mind reeled. Escape. Ava's mother. James's involvement. "So, James died because he was protecting her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded grimly. "James didn't just die. He was silenced. He was the one who held all the pieces of the puzzle. And once he started putting them together, they couldn't afford to let him live." Margaret's stomach turned. She had thought it was all about protecting Ava, about keeping the child safe. But it was so much darker than that. James hadn't just died in an accident. He had been murdered, targeted by a group of people with power far beyond anything she had imagined. And now she was tangled in it too. David stepped forward, his expression tense. "You need to leave, Margaret. This isn't your fight anymore. You have to walk away." But Margaret didn't hear him. Her mind was already racing ahead, calculating the next steps. She wasn't going to back down now. Not after everything she had learned. "Who are they?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Who killed James?" The man's lips curled into a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The truth is, Margaret, you're already too late." And in that moment, the door to the building slammed open, the sound of footsteps echoing in the hall. Someone else had arrived. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Whoever it was, they weren't here to talk. The door swung open, and Margaret felt her blood run cold as a tall figure stepped into the room. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the shadows, but his presence was undeniable. The air seemed to freeze around him, as if the very room knew that something monumental was about to happen. David's posture tensed immediately, and the man who had been talking to Margaret shifted uncomfortably, his eyes narrowing. The newcomer didn't say a word, but his gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on Margaret before locking onto the man who had been speaking to her. "Did you think you could hide from this?" The newcomer finally spoke, his voice low and controlled, almost like a threat waiting to explode. "Did you really think you could keep her out of it?" The room went dead silent. Margaret's mind raced, her pulse hammering in her ears as the weight of the situation bore down on her. The pieces were all there now, falling into place in a way that made her heart race with both fear and disbelief. This wasn't just a group with power. They were a well-oiled machine, a hidden force with influence that stretched far beyond anything she could have imagined. James had gotten too close to their secrets, and now she was standing right in the center of it all. The man who had been speaking to her earlier didn't meet the newcomer's eyes. Instead, he seemed to shrink back slightly, almost as if he feared the man's next move. "She's already involved. There's no going back now," he said quietly. The newcomer laughed, a dark, hollow sound that sent a chill down Margaret's spine. "That's what you think. You have no idea what's coming, do you? You thought you could just keep her in the dark, keep her safe. But you're all out of options now." Margaret's thoughts were a blur. Who was this man? What did he know that they didn't? And why had James's death led her here, to this very moment? "Tell her the truth," the newcomer demanded, his voice suddenly sharp. "Tell her why she's really here." The man across from Margaret swallowed, his face pale. "James wasn't just protecting Ava's mother. He was protecting you too, Margaret. You've been part of this from the start. Her breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. You never wondered why James was so secretive? Why he kept you out of certain things? He knew what would happen if you found out too much, the man continued, his voice strained with guilt. He kept you in the dark because he was trying to protect you from the same people who would go to any lengths to keep their operation hidden. You were always a target, Margaret. Always. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had thought that everything had been about James's involvement with Ava's mother, with this shadowy group. But now it was clear. She had been tangled in it all along. The person they had been trying to protect wasn't just James or Ava's mother. It was her. And now, she was in way over her head. Who are they? Who are these people? Margaret demanded, her voice growing louder with the urgency and terror she felt. The newcomer took a step forward, his eyes locking onto hers. They're a network, Margaret. A network of people who control the narrative, who pull the strings from behind the scenes. They manipulate governments, businesses, media, everything. They had to eliminate James because he knew too much. He was the key to unraveling their entire operation. And now, you're the next target. Margaret felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to stay upright, gripping the edge of the table for support. You're lying, she whispered, though a part of her was starting to believe him. The man's eyes softened, almost sympathetically. You don't want to believe it, but it's the truth. You've been part of their plan for longer than you know. And now that you're involved, there's no easy way out. David, who had been standing silent this whole time, finally spoke up. Margaret, you need to leave. Now. They'll come for you if they know you're here. But Margaret wasn't listening. She could feel the world around her shifting, her mind spinning with the enormity of everything she had just learned. James's death. Ava. The people pulling the strings. It all led back to this moment. She had been so sure that her life was one thing, an ordinary life with her husband. But now she saw that it had all been a lie carefully crafted by people who had used her, who had manipulated her from the start. Why didn't James tell me? She demanded. Why didn't he trust me with the truth? The newcomer shook his head slowly. He didn't want you involved because he knew what would happen if you did. He knew they'd come after you, just like they came after him. The room was spinning. Margaret's thoughts were a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and desperation. But in the midst of it all, one question kept echoing in her mind. Why now? Why had they waited until after James's death to reveal all of this? What did they gain by pulling her into this web of lies and deceit? Before she could voice another question, the door to the building slammed open again. This time, a group of men rushed in, their eyes scanning the room with laser-like intensity. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. They were here, the people who had been hunting James, and now it seemed they were after her too. David shoved her toward the back of the room. Go, he yelled, urgency in his voice. Get out of here, Margaret, now. But it was too late. The men were closing in, their eyes locked onto her with unsettling precision. Margaret knew she had no choice. She had to make a decision. Run and hide, or face whatever these men were willing to do to protect their secrets. In that moment, as the room seemed to close in on her, Margaret realized something. The truth was no longer a luxury. It was a weapon. And if she was going to survive, she had to use it. As the men closed in, Margaret's heart raced with adrenaline. Her mind was working in overdrive, calculating her next move. She knew there was no escape through the front door, not with them surrounding her. But she also knew that she had to think fast if she was going to get out of this alive. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, but the truth, the horrible truth, was that she had no idea who she could trust anymore. David's voice cut through the panic. Margaret, you have to go. Don't wait for me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his tone. He had already made up his mind. For a brief moment, she hesitated. David was a part of this, too, but could she truly trust him? Had he been working with these men all along? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but there was no time for doubt. She couldn't let herself be caught. Not now. Her legs moved almost on their own, running toward the back exit David had pointed out. The men were fast, but she was faster. She could hear their footsteps behind her, but she didn't dare look back. Her eyes were fixed on the narrow hallway ahead, and she sprinted with everything she had left. The exit door was just ahead. One final push. Margaret reached it and threw herself through, her heart hammering in her chest. But when she reached the outside, it wasn't over. She could hear the voices behind her, getting closer. She had to keep running. She had to stay ahead of them. She burst out into the cold night air, her lungs burning with the effort. The streets were empty, eerily quiet. The only sound was the pounding of her feet against the pavement. She didn't stop. She couldn't. Not yet. As she rounded the corner, she stumbled into a small alley, her breath ragged. The adrenaline was wearing off, and exhaustion set in. She pressed herself against the cold brick wall, trying to steady her breathing. There was no escape, not yet, but she had to think. She closed her eyes, remembering everything she had learned. The truth about James, the hidden network, the danger lurking around every corner. For a moment, she let herself feel the weight of it all, the crushing realization that her life was no longer her own. She was a pawn in someone else's game, and there was no going back. But then something shifted. A spark of defiance lit inside her. She couldn't just hide and run forever. She had to take control of her own fate. James had died fighting for a cause, for a person he loved, and if he could do that, then she could do the same. She wasn't going to let them win. She wasn't going to let her husband's death be in vain. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the alley, and Margaret froze. It was David. He was panting, his face flushed, but he wasn't out of breath. His eyes were focused on her, and as he got closer, the tension in the air only increased. "I told you to leave," David said, his voice low and filled with regret. "I didn't want you to get involved." Margaret stood her ground, her resolve hardening. "I don't have a choice anymore, David. You didn't give me one. You're a part of this too. You've been lying to me, hiding things from me. You need to tell me the truth. Everything." David looked at her for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Then, to her surprise, he nodded. "You're right," he admitted. "I didn't want you to know the truth, but you deserve to hear it. You deserve to know everything." Margaret's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Tell me what happened, David. Why didn't James trust me? Why didn't he tell me everything?" David looked down for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "James was trying to protect you, Margaret," he said finally. "The network, they wanted you. They wanted to use you as leverage. They knew you were connected to James, and they knew that he was starting to figure things out. He was getting too close to exposing them." Margaret felt the ground beneath her feet shift. "What do you mean? He was starting to expose them? Who are these people?" David's eyes were filled with regret. "I can't tell you everything, Margaret. Some things are too dangerous. But James was working with a group of people who were trying to bring the whole operation down. They were too powerful, too dangerous. They knew the risks. But he couldn't stop. He had to keep going. And that's why they killed him." The truth hit Margaret like a freight train, but she couldn't stop herself from asking the next question. "And what about me? Why am I involved in this? Why were they after me?" David's face darkened. "You were always part of the plan. They were watching you long before James even knew about them. They were waiting for the right moment to strike. And once James started digging, they knew they had to act fast." Margaret felt a cold shiver run through her. "And now? What happens now?" David didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else, perhaps guilt. "Now we fight. I know it's too late to turn back, but we have one last chance to take them down." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" David hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I know someone who can help. Someone who's been on the inside, who knows their weaknesses. If we can reach them before they reach us, we might be able to stop them." Margaret nodded slowly, her mind spinning with the possibilities. There was no going back now. The pieces had all come together, and there was only one thing left to do: fight. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and uncertainty, but Margaret knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything she had learned, after everything she had been through. She would do whatever it took to uncover the truth, to bring justice for James, and to take down the people who had taken everything from her. As she and David turned to leave the alley, Margaret realized that the fight had only just begun. The network was still out there, lurking in the shadows, but they had one thing that the enemy didn't: determination. And that, Margaret knew, was something no one could take from her.